Live exclusively for WCPT AM and FM in Chicago and streaming worldwide at chicagosprogressivetalk.com. Here's Hal Sparks.
That's right, folks. It's time to board the crazy train. And this time, instead of just grabbing onto the caboose and seeing where it leads us, we actually have a conductor. We are lucky enough to have on the line with us Angelo Carusone, if I'm pronouncing that right, because I know you mostly as Stop Beck. Are you with us?
Yep.
Hey, Angelo, good to talk to you, and thanks for being on the show.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm glad to talk to you, too.
Yeah, and it's I think it's fantastic. For many people that don't know, you started your own kind of one-man war against Glenn Beck in, strictly on a really smart, really peaceful, really articulate way. Just go after it. Just take things he says and let his sponsors know this is what this guy is saying. Do you want to be associated with this? How did that actually start for you? Like, what did it just? Was there a night where you're like, I can't believe this guy has commercials? How did it happen?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing for me is I don't really like impotent rage. I mean, obviously being emotional and frustrated about things, whether it be political or otherwise, is acceptable and normal. But I don't like the impotency that sort of comes along with that, especially on the left. There's a lot of that. And so for Beck, I mean, obviously he gets up on television every day, and he says the most ridiculous things. I mean, truly deceitful things. And ordinarily, I wouldn't care, except for the fact that his lies have consequences for us all.
Right.
His lies lead his fans to go out and do things that affect all of us, whether it be influence our public policy or scare us in public or all kinds of other things. So,
or in the case of Byron Williams, pack your car full of guns.
Like in the case of Byron Williams.
Drive to the Tides Foundation.
Me, I would much prefer that when you tell Glenn Beck or his bosses that, these are lies, this is vitriol, please stop it, that they would say, gee, you're right, this is irresponsible, we'll take care of it. I mean, that's my preference. But obviously, they didn't care.
Yeah.
So the only alternative was to either do nothing, which didn't seem acceptable to me, or to start going over their heads, and that would be to go after their sponsors and ask them if they're comfortable financially supporting this. And I realize that's sort of a somewhat extreme thing to do, but we're forced to do that when they abdicate total responsibility. I mean, they're completely shameless, and they operate with impunity. There's no consequences for their intentional lies. There's no consequences for their vitriol. So, here they are. Now there are consequences.
Mm-hmm. And it's been very effective. How many sponsors so far have gone down?
It's more than 300 now.
Yeah.
Wow!
Yeah.
Congratulations!
That have officially either left or said they will never. Which I'm sure is there's an unknown element where that you may not even be aware of, where people are going. I would never, looking at what's happened to his other sponsors, I would never allow my ads on that show.
Right. Yeah, that actually does happen a fair amount where, an advertiser has taken preemptive action and said, we're going to exclude our ads from Glenn Beck, so they actually never get targeted. But unfortunately for them, Fox News is so dry during these time periods to run ads that sometimes they run ads by mistake, whether it be an accident or they do it intentionally because they just need to fill the spot. I don't know. But sometimes some of those ads actually appear on Glenn Beck's show, and when I contact the advertiser, they're very frustrated because they have already taken preemptive measures not to let their ads run on the show, and then sure enough, they pop up because Fox News doesn't have many alternatives.
Right. And they've been losing them hand over fist during those that particular time slot for especially a year now, and you must feel some element of happiness about, for example, the WRR situation where Glenn Beck's radio show got dropped. For ratings issues. I mean, the public is to some degree starting to come around about this. He's at half the viewers he had at this time last year.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, he's right now his Fox News viewership has been halved. So that's significant because it reflects that people are just sort of sick and tired of it. And for me, I do Beck 4 hours a day. I listen to his radio show for 3 hours in the morning, and then his television show at night, and then he does all these little specials and what he calls documentaries, and obviously his universities. So I do all that stuff. So I get a healthy dose of Glenn Beck. And, it is reassuring to me to see people sort of tune out because the reality is he's very repetitive. I mean,
Yeah.
He plays the same audio, the same video clips, completely out of context, of course, but he just plays them over and over and over again. And, from a messaging perspective, given the fact that Glenn Beck is part of the Fox News political operation, obviously that is useful for their political purposes. But it does get very boring, and I suspect that many fans say, geez, this just isn't worth it.
Yeah. Well, and also I think he's had to go so far, because once you're basically riding on shock. He's trying to present to you information you've never heard before. You need to tune in all this week. I'm going to be showing you things that you never knew could be possible. Well, that's because you made them up in your head.
Right.
The abstract.
A perfect example of that is this week. Obviously, it just came out that his ratings have been halved. But just this week, he did a stunt with a bunny and a chainsaw, and he had been teasing it for like 3 days in advance that he was going to do something spectacular with a bunny and a chainsaw. And I was glad to see that most of the other media outlets didn't sort of take the bite and really hype this up. They just sort of ignored it as a typical Beck stunt. And I definitely am appreciating that people are starting to internalize that this guy is basically a sideshow. Obviously, his deceit is real, and the consequences are real, but he himself is a sideshow, and we shouldn't play into his sort of stunts that are designed to self-promote. And so I was glad that a lot of people didn't take that bite.
Yeah. And the interesting part, I think, is in the beginning, you had, like I said, Byron Williams, who was going to shoot up the Tides Foundation, he kept saying, Glenn Beck is a school teacher. He teaches you things you need to learn. You really do need to, he's the clarity that I was looking for and all those types of things. Meanwhile, because of the chalkboards. Now, I think the chalkboards may have looked like a cute stunt in the beginning. Now they look like the wall scribblings of Renfield in the loony bin as he's waiting for, his master to come get him. They literally look like just kind of like the number 23. Like I'm waiting for the moment where he starts drawing all over his face, like Jim Carrey in Liar, Liar going, the pen is blue, Because he's bordering on that. Here's my question to you. After this goes down, and it won't, and by the way, I believe he will go away with a whimper, not a bang. I think they will transfer him out, and he will kind of because they can't afford to let him go because his psycho viewers will come after people. If they fire him outright, they're just going to,
Yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that, because, the reality is I get asked this all the time, well, why is Glenn Beck still there? And, the reality is it's sort of a couple parts. Number one, Fox News executives agree with him. Right after they've defended him, and right after he got out and called President Obama a racist with a deep-seated hatred for white people or white culture, a few days later, Rupert Murdoch was on television, and he said, quote, if you listen to what he said, Glenn Beck, he was actually right. So they agree with him, number one.
Right.
Number two, they're a political operation, and Glenn Beck advances their political agenda, so they're willing to absorb the financial loss. And, of course, he does provide useful distractions, and their kind of politics relies on distracting us from the real issues, so there's some utility there. But the major issue, you definitely hit on it, is that they're in a real bind. If by keeping him, they lose money, they lose advertisers, they lose reputation, which it doesn't say very much for them, but they still lose it, and they have to deal with those consequences. And his fans still attack their advertisers for not advertising on Glenn Beck's show.
Right.
But if they let him go, the repercussions would be severe.
Absolutely.
When they pushed him out of their election night coverage, instead of just sitting home at night, Glenn Beck held competing coverage against Fox News on his website.
Yeah.
He made it clear that he's going to play hardball. He's in it for himself. His fans are not aligned with Fox News. I'm sure they appreciate it, they watch it, but they're devoted to Glenn Beck. And if they pushed him out, the repercussions would be fierce. So they're sort of, stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right. And I interestingly enough, I think there's probably a future for him in old school televangelism. We are not far from the Glenn Beck, taking over the 700 Club when Pat Robertson drifts away, because Pat Robertson is, I think Glenn Beck to some degree has been cutting his teeth on, goofy, smiley way to hide horrible elements of hate, and that's Pat Robertson playbook all the way. And using this religious base to give himself this artificial gravitas, taking the genuinely religious people who may be in the Tea Party movement, who really do have sort of a God-fearing angle, and they believe in some sort of coming retribution, and they're trying to live that way, and they're allowed to believe that way, but basically using that as a sales point for himself, and giving, and sort of co-opting that religious fervor. Is a tool that's been working on the right for a very long time.
It's true. And, for people that don't like Beck or sort of see through his deceit and his antics, it's very easy for us to chastise him. But the reality is this. Many of his fans are, they're our fellow citizens, they're real people, they have real anxieties about the country, they recognize that things are off, they have deep anxieties, the same way that I have deep anxieties about the way that we're going. And what Glenn Beck effectively does is he validates their anxieties. He says, yes, I see the anxiety. I feel your frustration. Here's the enemy. And, he reduces it down. He defines an incorrect enemy, of course, but he validates their feelings. And he does it through multiple means, whether it be through political explanations or, as you touched on, through religiosity. And, he does have this new self-help book out now, which touches on many religious aspects, and he often speaks in religious terms, but he does it in a way that's non-denominational. He even tells people to be wary of their churches if they talk about justice, social justice. And, he is using religious terms to validate people's anxieties and to advance, obviously, a conservative political agenda, as well as, and this can never be understated with Glenn Beck, his own personal agenda. Because at the end of the day, for him, it's about, selling books, selling products, making money. And so,
and he said so openly,
and, destruction, he doesn't care. He's completely reckless in the things that he says and obviously what flows out of that.
Exactly. We're going to take a break. Can you stick around for one more little break with us?
Definitely, I'd love to.
That'd be awesome. Thanks. We're on with Angelo Carusone. I'm looking at the old typed version that I have on my notes, and known as Stop Beck, of course, at Stop Beck on Twitter. We're getting, by the way, some little Twitter throwback from the Glenn Beck crowd because we're daring speak ill of him and his awesomeness. But we'll talk more about that when we come back. I'm Hal Sparks, WCPT Radio, Chicago's Progressive Talk. We'll be back right after this.
Spray paint the vegetable stock.